The river gave it back on a Tuesday, March 12th, 1906. The South Fork of the Kentucky River had been rising since Sunday, fed by 3 days of rain that came down not in curtains but in walls, the kind of rain that old Owsley County people described afterward as the sky deciding it would done with the land and wanted it returned to water. By Monday night, the bottom fields along the creek hollows had gone under. By Tuesday morning, the river itself had climbed 14 feet in 6 hours. 14 feet, which means the difference between a river and a catastrophe, between a thing in its place and a force without one. Willis Bowling was 11 years old that Tuesday, and he had no business being out in it. His mother had told him to stay on the porch. His father, Rufus, had already gone down toward the lower field with 2 of the hired hands to try to drag the fence posts out before the current took them, because fence posts cost money. And money in Owsley County in 1906 was not a thing you watched float away, if you could help it. Willis had stayed on the porch for maybe 20 minutes, watching the rain come sideways across the ridge and listening to the sound the South Fork made when it was angry, which was a sound less like water and more like something immense turning over in its sleep. Then he went down into it anyway, because he was 11, and because the river was doing something extraordinary, and because extraordinary things pull at 11-year-old boys the way gravity pulls at everything else. He followed the tree line down toward the ridge spur that jutted out where the old Bowling property curved closest to the water. His family had farmed this ground for 5 generations, farther back than anyone in the county could trace with paper, back to a time when Owsley County wasn't even a county yet, when it was just river valley and ridge and the families stubborn enough to stay in it. The land had a texture to it that Willis knew the way he knew his own hands. Every root and rock, every soft place where the ground gave slightly underfoot in spring, every limestone outcropping along the ridge where the bedrock pushed up through the hillside like old bones refusing to stay covered. The flood had exposed something on that ridge spur that had no business being exposed. Willis saw it from 30 yards away and stopped walking. The water had torn down through the hillside with a violence that left raw red clay on either side of a channel. And in the channel, in the place where soil and root and decades of accumulated leaf fall had always been, there was stone. Cut stone. Not the rough limestone that ran through this whole county in seams and shelves, but fitted stone, dressed stone, the kind of stone that human hands had shaped and placed with intention. There was a doorway. It was low, maybe 5 feet tall, maybe 4 feet wide, and the lintel stone across the top was a single piece, gray-brown and straight-edged in a way that nature does not produce. The door itself was gone, rotted away or removed, and beyond the threshold there was darkness. And from the darkness there came a smell that Willis Bowling would describe, decades later, at the age of 94, as the smell of a very long time. He stood there in the rain, looking at it for what felt like several minutes, but was probably 30 seconds. Then he turned and ran back up toward the house, screaming for his father, with a volume that cut even through the sound of the swollen river. Rufus Bowling heard his son before he saw him. He came up from the lower field at a pace that was not quite running. Rufus was not a man who ran unless something was burning, and met Willis halfway up the slope. And Willis grabbed his father's sleeve with both hands and pointed back down toward the ridge spur and said, breathless and shaking, that there was a room down there, that the river had washed it out, that there was a room in the hill, and something was in it. Rufus stood still for a moment. Something moved across his face that Willis noticed but could not name. It was not surprise exactly. It was something closer to a man who has been waiting for news he always knew was coming, and now finds it has arrived. He said, "Show me." They went back down together through the rain. Rufus walking with a steadiness that Willis would remember all his life as the most frightening thing about that morning. Not the room, not what was in it, but the fact that his father walked toward it, the way you walk toward something you have imagined many times and are now simply confirming exists. When they reached the ridge spur and stood before the stone doorway, Rufus looked at it for a long time without speaking. Willis watched his father's face in the gray morning light. Rufus Bowling was 43 years old, a lean, quiet man with the kind of face that Owsley County produced in those years, weathered early, careful with expression, carrying something behind the eyes that was not quite sadness and not quite something else. Then Rufus said quietly, almost to himself, "I hoped the river would never find it. Not, I didn't know this was here. Not, Lord God, what is that? Not, this makes no sense to me. I hoped the river would never find it." Willis heard those words and understood, in the way children understand things before they can articulate them, that the distinction mattered enormously. His father had known. His father had not been surprised. His father had been hoping. Rufus sent Willis back to the house to fetch the lantern from the barn. He waited at the threshold, not going in, not stepping back, standing in the rain with his arms at his sides, looking at the darkness beyond the cut stone lintel. When Willis came back with the lantern lit, Rufus took it, looked at his son for a moment as if deciding something, and then nodded toward the house. "Go on back up," he said. "Papa?" "Willis." The tone was not harsh, but it was finished. "Go on back up to the house and stay there. Don't say anything to your mother yet." Willis went, but not all the way. He stopped at the edge of the tree line in the rain and watched his father crouch and step through the low doorway with the lantern held out in front of him and disappear into the dark. The light from the lantern moved inside for a while. Willis could see it shifting through cracks in the stonework, a faint amber moving and pausing and moving again. Then it stopped moving. It stayed still in there for a long time. Willis counted, later, that it must have been close to 10 minutes, maybe longer. Just that still glow behind Old Stone. When Rufus came back out, he stood in the rain for a moment without looking at the doorway. He looked up the ridge toward the house. His face had gone to something Willis could not read at all. Not grief, not horror, not revelation, but something quieter and older than any of those. Something that looked almost like a man completing a thought he had been working on for 20 years, and finding that the answer was exactly what he had always suspected it would be. He walked back up to the house. He did not speak of it that day. It was 3 days before Rufus Bowling walked up the muddy track to Boonville to speak to Sheriff John Combs. The town of Boonville, in 1906, was the county seat of Owsley County, which is to say, it was the largest concentration of human habitation in a county that had roughly 5,000 people scattered across 400 square miles of mountain and hollow and river valley. The town itself had perhaps 300 souls, a courthouse, 3 churches, 2 general stores, a mill, and the usual array of structures that collect around a courthouse in a small Appalachian county in the first years of the 20th century. There was no railroad to Boonville. The railroad had been a subject of discussion and hope for decades, but had not arrived and would not arrive for years yet. There was no telegraph. The roads were dirt, beautiful in dry weather and nearly impassable when wet, and March in Owsley County is not dry weather. Rufus Bowling walked the 4 miles to town and back, which was not unusual. 4 miles of mountain road was not a distance that Owsley County people in 1906 considered remarkable. He came home that evening and told his wife, Cora, that the sheriff would be coming out to look at something the flood had turned up on the Ridge property. Cora asked what kind of something. Rufus said it was old. She asked how old. He said he didn't know for certain, which may have been the only truly accurate statement he made on the subject. Sheriff John Combs came out the following day with a deputy named Hale and a man from the county who served as something between a justice of the peace and a coroner when the county required one. The rain had stopped, and the South Fork was already dropping, leaving behind the thick brown silt line on every tree and stone that marked the flood's high point like a dirty tide mark. The 4 of them, Rufus, the sheriff, the deputy, and the justice coroner, walked down to the ridge spur in the pale March sunlight and stood before the stone doorway. Sheriff Combs was a tall man from a long line of Owsley County people himself, which meant he was familiar with the landscape of old secrets in ways that a sheriff from somewhere else might not have been. He looked at the cut stone lintel for a while before he said anything. Then he said he needed the lantern. Rufus gave it to him. Combs went in alone first, which was the kind of thing that said something about Combs, and came out after a few minutes and sent Hale in, and they went through it systematically in the way that men with authority try to establish what they are dealing with before they have to say it out loud. What they found, what John Combs wrote in his official record, which still exists in the Owsley County Courthouse, water-stained and faded but legible, was as follows. A stone chamber, approximately 12 feet by 8 feet, with a ceiling of roughly 6 feet, constructed of fitted limestone blocks without mortar, the work of a skilled mason with access to good material. The chamber was dry, which was remarkable given the flood. The construction was tight enough that water had not penetrated beyond the doorway, which explained the preservation of what was inside. A ring of iron was set into the far wall, embedded in the stone, at a height consistent with a standing adult. Attached to that ring, a chain. The chain was perhaps 8 feet long, and at its far end, on the stone floor of the chamber, lay the remains of a human being. Combs's report was careful about what it said and did not say. He wrote that the remains were skeletal, that they appeared to be those of a male, estimated between 30 and 45 years of age at time of death, and that the condition of the remains suggested death had occurred between 50 and 70 years prior to the discovery, which placed the death somewhere between 1836 and 1856. He noted that he could identify no evidence of violence. The bones were intact. Nothing was fractured or displaced in a manner consistent with a blow or a wound. The man had not been killed. He had died. The distinction, in Combs's mind, seemed important, and he returned to it in his notes. No evidence of violence. Natural causes, he wrote, while chained. Beside the remains, a pewter cup, a pewter plate. Both objects of quality, not the rough tin that a poor family would have used for a prisoner, but good pewter, the kind of tableware a household of modest means would consider respectable. The plate had a faint decorative rim. The cup had been mended once, a small crack repaired with solder that had gone dark with age. Someone had not merely given this man a vessel to eat from. They had given him a decent one, and when it broke, they had fixed it. There was a Bible. It had disintegrated almost completely, the leather cover gone to powder, the pages fused into a single block by decades of humidity and then desiccation. What remained was barely identifiable as a book at all, more a compressed mass of organic matter, the size and approximate shape of a Bible, but the spine could still be seen, and a few pages at the center of the block had partially survived. The print on those pages was King James, and the passages visible. When Combs had a man from Boonville who had studied at a seminary look at them under careful examination, were from the Book of Job. There was a blanket, or what had been a blanket, wool once, now a mat of brown compressed fiber that still held, faintly, a geometric pattern in its weave. Someone had given this man a blanket. Someone had given him a Bible and a decent plate and a cup that they repaired when it broke, and a blanket against the cold of a stone room in the Kentucky mountains in winter. On the walls of the chamber, cut into the stone, with what appeared to be the sharp edge of the chain itself, were marks. Tally marks. Groups of 5, crossed at the 4th. They covered 2 full sections of the wall from roughly waist height to above the head of a standing man. Combs did not count them in his official report, but his deputy Hale counted them later, more than once, and each time arrived at a number that he found so disturbing he did not include it in any document, but instead told it to his son, who told it to his son, which is how it eventually entered the record of this story at all. Hale's count was somewhere between 3,000 and 3,500 marks, depending on how you group the deteriorated ones. 3,000 days is roughly 8 years. 3,500 days is nearly 10. However long he had been there, he had counted every day of it. Rufus Bowling stood outside the chamber while the sheriff and his men worked inside it. He answered questions when asked. He said he did not know who the man was. He said the chamber had been on the property when his father showed it to him. He said he had been told not to go in or speak of it. He said he had honored that. Combs asked him directly, "Rufus, do you know whose bones those are?" Rufus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, sir, not for certain." Combs looked at him for a while. "Not for certain," he repeated. "No, sir." This answer, which was perhaps technically accurate in the narrowest possible sense, seemed to satisfy Combs sufficiently to let the matter rest at the edge of an inquiry, rather than plunge into the center of one. Owsley County in 1906 operated on certain understandings about family and history, and the difference between what could be officially known and what was better left at the edge. Combs was a man of his place and time, which means he understood that some things, once you started pulling at them, would not stop until they had unraveled things that nobody living had done and nobody living deserved to have unraveled around them. He completed his examination. He filed his report. He wrote that the identity of the remains was unknown, and that given the age of the deceased, dead before the Civil War, dead before many of the institutions that might have tracked such things even existed in Owsley County in their current form. Determination of identity was not possible. The remains were removed from the chamber and given a Christian burial in the Bowling family plot. The stone placed over the grave read, "Known to God." It did not record a name, a date, a relationship. It said only what it said, that somewhere, by something, this man was known. Willis Bowling watched the burial from beside his father. He was still 11. The world was still the world it had been before March 12th, 1906, except that it wasn't, not quite, and wouldn't be again. He looked at the stone that said, "Known to God," and then looked at his father's face and thought, in the wordless way of children, that his father knew more than the stone said, that someone living knew, that the river had tried to give something back, and the living were trying, quietly, carefully, to put it back underground. He never asked his father directly. Not that day, not ever. Rufus Bowling died in 1931, and whatever he had been shown at 16, whatever his father Elias had told him when he led him to the chamber and said no one goes in and no one speaks of it, he took it with him, which is what the Bowlings had been doing with this particular piece of their history for a very long time. But Willis Bowling lived to 94, and what he knew, he carried. And what he eventually said, near the end of his life, in a voice that was old and careful and exactly as precise as it needed to be, was this: "Some things are between you and the river. To understand what the river gave back, you have to go back. You have to go back through the generations the way the river cut through the hillside, stripping away the layers, finding what had been buried, finding what the burying had been for. Each generation of Bowlings knew less of the story than the one before it, which is how secrets survive. Not by being kept perfectly, but by being told partially, and then partially again, until what the last keeper holds is only a shape, only a prohibition, only the knowledge that a thing exists without the knowledge of what it is or why. Rufus knew there was a room. He had been shown it once, at 16, by his father Elias, and told the rule: no one goes in, no one speaks of it. He had honored the rule for 27 years. He had not asked why. He had not looked. He had hoped, and the word hope, in this context, carries its full weight, that the river would never make the question unavoidable. He had been given a burden without a reason, and carried it the way you carry a burden you've been told to carry, without looking at it too directly, without setting it down, without asking whether the man who gave it to you had the right to give it. He knew the room was there. He knew it was old. He knew it was not to be spoken of. And somewhere, maybe, in the way that children absorb the weight of adult silences, he suspected there had been someone in it. Because the alternative, that the room had been built for storage or for shelter, or for any of the innocent purposes a room can be built for, does not explain the instruction that it never be spoken of. You don't forbid speaking of a root cellar. You don't tell a child, with a gravity that leaves marks, that a smokehouse must never be mentioned. The severity of the prohibition was itself a clue, and Rufus had lived with that clue for 27 years without following it. Or perhaps he had followed it in his own way. Perhaps the hope he spoke of, I hoped the river would never find it, was itself a form of knowledge. Perhaps he had understood, on the level of things felt rather than things said, that what was in that room was something his family had done, and that the river finding it meant the world would eventually know something about the Bowlings that the Bowlings had decided the world did not need to know. He did what he could. He answered the sheriff's questions carefully. He buried the man with a decent stone. He went home and he never spoke of it to Willis. Not the rule his father had given him, not the room itself, not the man in it. He added another layer of silence to the inheritance and passed it on. But Willis had already seen it. The river had seen to that. To find the next layer, you have to go back to Elias. Elias Bowling was born in 1832 and died in 1899, which means he never lived to see the flood, never had to stand in the rain outside that stone doorway and account for what his own silence had helped to preserve. He died 7 years before the river made the question unavoidable, which may or may not have been mercy, depending on how you understand mercy. He had spent 67 years knowing something that he never fully said, and he died having said almost none of it, having passed on to his son Rufus only the prohibition and not the reason, the rule, and not the meaning, the warning to stay away, without the explanation of what exactly the staying away was for. Almost none of it, not quite none. There was one night, there was one occasion on which Elias Bowling, who was not a drinking man in any habitual sense, but who was a man subject to the ordinary human failures of his time and place, and who occasionally drank more than was good for him at the gatherings that constituted social life in Owsley County in the years after the Civil War. There was one night on which Elias said something that he should not have said, or at least said it in the presence of someone who was paying attention. The someone was a woman named Dorcas Bowling, who was not his wife but his father's sister. His great aunt, in the common understanding, though family relationships in communities that had been in place for 5 generations and had intermarried with 3 or 4 other families in ways that only long-term residents could fully track, were not always so cleanly described. Dorcas was born in 1820, which means she was 12 years old when Elias was born, and 53 years old at the time she witnessed what she witnessed. She lived to be 83, and by the time anyone thought to ask her what she knew, she was speaking in the fragmentary, non-linear way of the very old, which is a way of speaking that is easy to dismiss and dangerous to dismiss, because the very old are not confused about everything and the things they remember clearly. They remember with a fidelity that younger memories cannot match. The investigator, who eventually pieced together what Dorcas knew was not a professional, not a sheriff or a historian, but a man named Luther Cawood, who had been raised in Owsley County, had gone to study at Berea College in the 1880s, and had come back with a conviction that the history of his own people was worth the same kind of careful attention that educated men gave to the histories of other places. He was not well known outside the county. He kept notebooks. He talked to old people, which is the most important tool a local historian has, and the most underused one, because old people in their 80s and 90s carry living memory of events that no document records, and their accounts, properly handled, properly cross-referenced, properly respected, are irreplaceable. Luther Cawood talked to Dorcas Bowling in 1903, 3 years before the flood, when she was 83, and living with her grandniece's family on the North Fork. He recorded what she said in his notebook in his careful, slightly old-fashioned hand. Most of what she told him was of the ordinary historical variety. Recollections of the county in her youth, memories of the families, the circuit preacher's visits, the flooding of such and such year, the winter of the hard freeze, the year of the cholera. And then, when Cawood asked about the Bowling family in particular, about the old home place on the South Fork, Dorcas had gone quiet in a way he noted as distinct from her usual pauses. She said, "Elias knew something he didn't ought to know." Cawood asked what she meant. She said that there had been a night. She placed it in the 1870s, in the period after the Civil War, when the county was slowly reassembling itself, and when the gatherings that passed for community life were beginning again after years of disruption. When she had heard Elias Bowling say something at a whiskey gathering at the Sizemore place on Cow Creek. She had not been drinking herself. She had been present because her husband was there, and because women attended these things in Owsley County, not to drink, but to manage the consequences of the drinking. She had been sitting near the fire with two other women, and Elias had been on the other side of the room in the company of several men, and he had been further along in his drinking than she had realized, until she heard what he said. She heard him say, "There's a man under the ridge who's kin to us, and he earned that chain." The other men in his immediate circle had apparently changed the subject quickly. Men who have grown up with certain family silences know when they are in the presence of something being transgressed, and they respond to it the way you respond to someone about to walk off a ledge. You redirect them, firmly and without drawing attention to the direction, back toward safe ground. The conversation moved elsewhere. Elias, who was not so far gone that he didn't sense the redirection, let it move. He did not repeat himself. But Dorcas had heard. And Dorcas, who was 53 and sharp and who had been born in this county and knew its terrain of secrets better than most, understood that she had just heard something that was not meant to be said. She did not ask Elias about it. She never asked him about it. But she kept it. The way you keep certain things, not because you know what to do with them, but because they have a weight that makes them impossible to simply discard. And because in a place where history runs as deep as blood, you understand on some fundamental level that everything means something, and that the meaning of some things takes a very long time to become clear. She told Luther Cawood about it in 1903 because he asked the right questions, and because she was 83, and perhaps because she felt that the wait was something that should not simply end with her. She told him what she had heard. "There's a man under the ridge who's kin to us, and he earned that chain." Cawood wrote it down. He wrote in his notes beside it, "Elias knew the identity. He knew the man was a Bowling. He believed the confinement was deserved." This suggests the story was told to him in a moral frame, not as a crime of the family, but as a decision of the family. He received it as a verdict, not a secret shame. That last observation is important. The shame of a family secret lies in its content, in the thing that was done, in the thing that was hidden. But the telling of it, within the family, from generation to generation, can be shaped by the teller. And what Elias received, apparently, was a version of the story in which the man in the room deserved to be there, in which the chain was a just response to something the man had done. He earned that chain. Those are the words of someone who believes, or who has been told to believe, that a moral accounting took place, that the chain was not an act of monstrous cruelty, but an act of proportionate response to something monstrous. Who gave Elias this version? His father, which means we have to go back further. Elias's father was a man named Augustus Bowling, born in 1810, and Augustus is the fulcrum on which this entire story turns. He is the generation that made the decision. He is the man who chose. He is the one who stood at the branching point where several roads presented themselves and took the one he believed, for reasons that we are only now, 160 years later, in any position to even partially understand. But to understand Augustus, you first have to understand something about what Owsley County was in 1840, and what the absence of law meant in a place that had been settled for 60 years and still existed in many fundamental ways outside the structure of formal justice. Owsley County had been carved out of the surrounding counties in 1843, but the communities along the South Fork had existed under various earlier county designations since the late 18th century. The founding families, the Bowlings, the Combs, the Turners, the Eversoles, the Bakers, had been in these hills since before statehood, before the legal infrastructure of courts and sheriffs and regular circuit riders had developed enough to touch the daily lives of people living on the deeper hollows and more remote ridges. By 1840, there were courts. There were official structures, but the official structures were thin and unreliable and slow in ways that anyone who needed them urgently would find inadequate. And the communities of Owsley County, like communities throughout the Appalachian backcountry in that period, operated on a parallel system of informal justice that was older, faster, and more intimate than anything the law could offer. This was not lawlessness in the sense of chaos. It was lawfulness of a different order, a community-administered sense of right and wrong that functioned through reputation, memory, and the kind of accountability that comes from living your entire life among people who know everything about you and whose opinion of you is the substance of your social existence. A man who wronged another in Owsley County in 1840 was not primarily worried about the circuit court, which met infrequently and required evidence in forms that the backcountry rarely produced. He was worried about what his neighbors knew and what they would do about it. He was worried about his family's standing in a world where your family's standing was your entire world. And he was worried about something else in the years leading up to 1840 and through the 1840s. He was worried about what happened when community justice, as opposed to formal justice, reached its verdict. Because community justice in that time and place was not gentle. Community justice meant shaming, exclusion, ostracism, or, at its most severe, the kind of direct action that left no record and required no court. Augustus Bowling understood all of this in March of 1840. He understood it because he was a man of his time and place, and he had seen it operate, and he was facing a situation that required him to understand it very well indeed. The letter exists. This is worth stating plainly, because so much of this story depends on fragments and reconstructions and accounts transmitted across generations in the particular broken telephone manner of family memory. And the letter is different. The letter is a document. It is ink on paper, and it still exists, preserved inside the back cover of a Bible that was identified as belonging to Augustus. Bowling of Owsley County, Kentucky, recovered in 1947 from the estate of a Bowling family descendant in Lexington who had kept it without knowing precisely what it contained, and passed eventually to the Owsley County Historical Society, which is where Luther Cawood's great-niece found it in 1978 and understood, for the first time, that the notebook her great-uncle had kept in 1903 and the letter in the Bible were parts of the same thing. The letter is addressed to a minister. The minister's name is partially illegible. The surname is gone, eaten by the moisture that had found its way into the Bible's back cover over the decades, but the given name appears to be Ezra or Ezekiel, and the salutation suggests a man of some religious standing in the community, perhaps a circuit preacher or a local elder. The date is not given, but contextual clues, the handwriting, the paper, the specific phrasing of the legal anxiety, suggest the 1840s, likely between 1840 and 1845. Augustus Bowling was not a man who wrote easily. The letter is labored, the hand careful with its letters in the way of a man who writes rarely and knows it. What he says slowly, choosing each word with a deliberateness that makes the whole thing feel less like correspondence and more like a confession or a justification, which is often the same thing. But it is direct. It says what it means, and what it means is this: my brother has done something that cannot be taken to law, for the law would hang him and destroy us. I have chosen to keep him where he cannot do more harm, and to care for him as Christian duty requires. That is the heart of it. Those three clauses: my brother, cannot be taken to law, chosen to keep him. Every word is doing work. Every word is a decision made visible. The rest of the letter is context and justification, and the context and justification tell you things that the central statement does not. Augustus writes about his family. He writes about his mother, who was still living at the time of writing, an elderly woman who had given the best years of her life to the Ridge Farm, who had never had anything but hard work and the company of her children and her faith, and who, in Augustus's clear view, could not survive the public destruction of her son. He writes about the Bowling name, not with vanity, not with the puffed self-importance of a family that thinks too well of itself, but with the plain practical accounting of a man who understands that in a small community where family reputation is the currency of daily life, the destruction of that reputation impoverishes everyone attached to it, including people who had nothing to do with the thing that destroyed it. He had children. His brother's wife had children. Children who had done nothing, whose father's act was not their act, who would bear the weight of it regardless. He writes about the law. He writes about it with a specificity that suggests he had thought about it very carefully, had perhaps even consulted someone, possibly the minister to whom he was writing, about what the law would actually do. And what the law would do, Augustus had clearly concluded, was hang his brother. The evidence, whatever it was sufficient for community knowledge, but perhaps not sufficient for a formal conviction. But in Owsley County in the 1840s, the distance between community knowledge and a rope was not always very far, and the formal proceeding of a trial was itself a kind of destruction. A trial makes everything public. A trial names names and states facts and puts your family's worst hour into the record where it lives forever. Even if the verdict were not death, the trial would be. He writes about God, not at length, but with feeling, A man who is trying to square what he is about to do with a faith that he apparently takes seriously and finding the squaring difficult. He writes that he does not believe he is doing right. He writes, and this sentence survives clearly enough to be quoted, that he believes he is doing what is least wrong, which is different. The distinction between right and least wrong is not a small one. A man who believes he is doing right is sustained by his belief. A man who believes he is doing least wrong is sustained by nothing except the grim arithmetic of his alternatives, and he knows it, and he lives with it. The alternatives. Augustus names them in his careful labored hand, and the naming is itself a kind of intellectual honesty that demands acknowledgement. He names 3. He could let the community learn what his brother had done, and let community justice take its course. This would likely mean his brother's death, not a hanging, which would at least have the formal dignity of a legal proceeding, but the rougher, less accountable kind of death that community justice administered in that time and place. A death by night, probably. A death that would be generally known and never spoken of, that would leave a widow and children without even the formal record of a verdict. And his family would be destroyed alongside, not necessarily physically, but socially, economically, in all the ways that destruction counts in a small and isolated community. He could go to the formal courts. He had apparently weighed this most carefully, and the conclusion he reached was that the formal courts could not be trusted to produce a result proportionate to what his brother had done, or proportionate to the harm that a trial would cause. He had, perhaps, talked to someone with legal knowledge. The circuit court in Owsley County in the early 1840s was not the most reliable instrument of justice, even by the standards of its time, and the outcome of formal proceedings, in terms of whether a conviction was obtained, in terms of what sentence was imposed, in terms of what the community learned and how, was genuinely uncertain in ways that the alternatives were not. He could kill his brother himself. He does not name this alternative directly, but it sits behind everything else he writes with the heavy presence of a thing that has been considered and set aside. Fratricide. The oldest crime in the human story, and one that does not require a particular shortage of motive to understand, since the circumstances he is dealing with are themselves extreme. He did not do it. He could not. Whether the reason was love or faith or a specific horror at the act itself, he could not kill his brother, and he knew it. And so, the fourth choice, the one he made, the one that required the letter. He would keep his brother where he could do no more harm. He would care for him as Christian duty required. He would not let him go. He would not kill him. He would put him in the stone room on the ridge, the room that was already there, that had been built for a different purpose or a different time. And he would give him what he could give him, and he would not speak of it, and he would manage this thing himself, within the family, without the law, and without the community, because the law would destroy everything, and the community would destroy everything, and this was the only way he could see to manage a situation that had no good management. He would become his brother's jailer. The moral weight of this decision is not easily measured. The tendency, when you encounter it from a distance of a century and a half, is to flatten it, either into monstrosity, because a man kept his brother chained in a stone room for years, or into heroism, because a man sacrificed his own peace of mind to spare his family and to preserve, rather than extinguish a human life. Both flattenings are wrong. The thing Augustus did was neither monstrous nor heroic in any simple sense. It was what it was, a human being in an impossible situation, making the decision that he could live with, which is all that impossible situations ever offer. What it cost him every day, for however many years Lemuel lived in that room, is not recorded anywhere. There is no second letter, no diary, no document that tells us what Augustus felt when he walked down to the ridge spur with the day's food, with the pewter cup filled and the pewter plate loaded, with the Bible under his arm for the reading that was apparently a feature of these visits. There is no record of what passed between the brothers in that stone room, whether they spoke, whether Lemuel raged or accepted or withdrew into some private place that his brother's visits could not reach, whether Augustus prayed, whether he was still praying, or whether the years of this had made prayer feel like the wrong instrument for the scale of the thing. We know the pewter cup was repaired. That is a fact from the physical record. At some point, the cup cracked or broke. Pewter is an alloy that becomes brittle with age and use, and someone took it to a smith and had it mended with solder. Someone decided that a broken cup was worth fixing. That decision, which seems small, is actually enormous. It is the decision to continue. It is the decision that the man in the room was still worth the trouble of a repaired cup. It is the decision that comfort, however minimal, was still the obligation. We know the Bible was read to disintegration. That is also a fact from the physical record. The pages wore down. The spine gave out. The covers went to dust. Whether Lemuel read it himself, whether Augustus brought in enough light for reading, whether the chain permitted the full range of motion a reader requires, or whether it was read aloud, which is the other possibility, we cannot know. But it was used. It was used so thoroughly that by the time 150 years had passed and it was removed from the chamber, it was barely identifiable as a book. That much use requires years. That much use requires someone caring enough to bring it, to maintain it, to sit in a stone room in the Kentucky mountains and read from the book of Job to a man who had been chained to a wall. Job. Of all the books in the Bible to wear down to nothing in a stone room, it was Job. Whether this was accident, whether Job simply happened to be the portion of the Bible open when the reading began, and remained open because the disintegration started from the outside in, or whether it was chosen deliberately because its subject matter was felt to be appropriate, we cannot know. But Job is a book about a righteous man, stripped of everything, afflicted without explanation, demanding answers from the universe, and receiving instead a reminder that the universe does not owe him an explanation, that the scale of things is larger than the scale of his understanding, that suffering does not require a justification proportionate to the scale of the suffering, that some things are beyond. Whether Lemuel read Job as a prisoner seeking meaning in his suffering, or whether someone read it to him as a form of comfort, or as something that was neither comfort nor accusation, but simply the most honest thing either of them had, no one knows. What we know is that it was used down to nothing. Augustus Bowling lived to 1878. He outlived his brother. The tally marks suggest Lemuel died somewhere in the mid to late 1840s, or perhaps the early 1850s, and the sheriff's estimation of 50 to 70 years before 1906 gives us a range of 1836 to 1856 for the death, with the evidence of wear suggesting the longer end of the range rather than the shorter. So Augustus likely had decades after his brother's death in which to live with what he had done, in which to sit with the knowledge that he had kept a man chained in a stone room until that man died, and then had maintained the silence around it, and then had carried it forward for however many more years his own life gave him. What he told his son, Elias, we do not know precisely, but we know the shape of what he told him because of what Elias said that night at the Sizemore gathering, in the drunk and unguarded moment that Dorcas Bowling witnessed. He earned that chain. That is the moral frame Augustus transmitted. Not, I did a terrible thing to your uncle. Not, there is a room on the property where I kept your uncle until he died, and it was wrong, and I need you to know that I know it was wrong. But he earned it. The chain was just. The confinement was proportionate. Whether Augustus actually believed this, or whether it was the only story he could construct that let him function as a father and a man in his community, we cannot know. The letter to the minister, I do not believe I am doing right. I believe I am doing what is least wrong, suggests a man with a less settled conscience than the moral frame he gave his son would imply. Perhaps by the time he came to transmit the story to Elias, he had needed to believe it. Perhaps the decades of living with the decision had required him to reconstruct it in terms he could inhabit. Perhaps he told Elias the story he needed Elias to have, which was a story about justice rather than a story about necessity. He earned that chain. Elias received this. He carried it for decades, and on one drunk night, he let a fragment of it slip, and Dorcas Bowling heard it, and she kept it for 30 years, and eventually told it to Luther Cawood, who wrote it in his notebook in 1903, and who did not know, could not have known, that 3 years later, a flood would expose a stone chamber on the South Fork, and the question of what Elias knew would suddenly become a great deal more than a local historian's curiosity. But there is still a layer beneath Augustus. There is still the question of why the room existed at all, and what it had been built for, and whether Lemuel Bowling was the first person to be kept in it. Because the room was not built by Augustus. The room was older than Augustus's decision. The chain that had worn its ring into the wall over decades, the ring embedded in the stone, the iron darkened and pitted with age. The metalwork on that chain and on that ring was identified by 2 blacksmiths who examined it in the weeks after the flood, as consistent with hardware produced in the late 18th century. Not the 1840s, not even the turn of the century. The 1780s, or perhaps the 1790s, based on the specific type of iron, the specific manner of the forge work, the specific design of the ring's mounting. Details that experienced smiths could read the way a geologist reads stone, as evidence of a particular time and particular hands. The 1780s, which is when Absalom Bowling first settled on the South Fork, which is when the Bowling family's story in Owsley County began. To reconstruct what Lemuel Bowling did, you have to work with fragments. There is no confession, no court record, no document that says plainly, Lemuel Bowling of Owsley County, Kentucky, did the following thing in the following year and was held accountable in the following manner. The fragment record is the only record, and the fragment record requires assembly. Careful, honest assembly that acknowledges what is known and does not dress up what is inferred as established fact. Here is what is known. Lemuel Bowling appears in the 1840 federal census as a resident of what would become Owsley County, Kentucky, age approximately 28. Occupation farmer, living in proximity to his brother Augustus and his family. He is listed as a head of household. He had a wife. He had children. At least 2, possibly 3, the handwriting of the enumerator making the precise number unclear. He is a person in the record. He exists. Lemuel Bowling does not appear in the 1850 federal census, not in Owsley County, not in any adjacent county in Kentucky, not under variant spellings, not in any neighboring state. He is simply gone from the record, not dead by the record's accounting, since there is no death record, no burial record, no gravestone in any Bowling family plot that corresponds to him, no widow's listing, no orphaned children in a relative's household. He vanished from the public record as cleanly as a stone dropped into the South Fork, which leaves a ripple for a moment, and then nothing. This kind of disappearance was not, in itself, unusual in the mid-19th century American backcountry. People moved without record. Men left families and established themselves elsewhere under different identities or simply outside the range of census takers. Death in rural Kentucky in the 1840s produced paperwork only in the most official of circumstances, and in a hollow on the South Fork, the most official of circumstances was not the standard. Lemuel's absence from the 1850 census could have innocent explanations. Except that it doesn't, because we know, from what Dorcas heard, from what the letter says, from the chamber and the chain and the tally marks on the wall, that Lemuel did not move away. He did not walk off into a new life somewhere else. He died in that room, chained to that wall, counting the days in marks on stone. His disappearance from the record was engineered. Someone removed him. Not from life immediately, but from the public record of life, from the census and the community rolls and the ordinary accounting of a person's existence, and put him in a stone room instead. Someone with the motive and the means to do that. Someone with authority over the property and authority over the family narrative. Someone named Augustus. So we know the what. We know, approximately, the when. Sometime between 1840 and 1845, most likely, the period in which Augustus would have made the decision and executed it. And we know the why in the broadest sense. Because Lemuel did something. Something that Augustus describes, in his letter, as something that cannot be taken to law, not because the law would be inadequate to it, but because the law would hang him. The law would hang him means the law would consider it a capital offense. In Kentucky in the 1840s, the capital offenses were murder, rape, and a short list of other severe crimes. Whatever Lemuel did, his brother believed it would earn him a rope. What did he do? Here we enter the most uncertain part of the reconstruction, the part where the fragments require the most careful handling. But the fragments exist, and they point in a direction. The first fragment comes from a court record in a neighboring county, not Owsley, which was not officially constituted until 1843, but one of the counties from which Owsley was later carved. In the court records of that county, in a term that took place in the early 1840s, the exact year is partially illegible, the date obscured by water damage. There is a reference, in the context of a civil dispute about property boundaries to a matter involving, and here the record becomes relevant. A Bowling of the South Fork settlement, said matter having been resolved without the court's further involvement. The nature of the matter is not named. The resolution, without the court's further involvement, implies that a court had some involvement at some prior point, or was at least consulted, before being effectively stepped away from. This is consistent with a situation in which a crime was known to the community, was brought to the attention of legal authority in some preliminary way, and then was resolved through other means before any formal proceeding was undertaken. The second fragment is more personal. It comes from the Turner family. The Turners were one of the founding families of the South Fork settlement, neighbors of the Bowlings for as long as either family had been in the county, which is to say, since before the county existed. In 1906, after the flood and the chamber and the sheriff's investigation, after the story had begun to circulate in the way that such stories circulate in small communities, in whispers and implications that spread from household to household without ever taking the form of official statement. A member of the Turner family spoke to Luther Cawood, who by this time had his notebook out and was paying close attention. The Turner family member was an elderly woman. Cawood does not give her first name in his notes, calling her only Mrs. Turner of the Cow Creek branch, who said that her family carried a tradition about a bowling man, an unspecified bowling man from what she estimated as her grandparents' generation, who had harmed a Turner man in a way that her family considered severe, and that the community had known about it, and that the Bowling family had dealt with it in a way that her family had accepted, not forgiven, but accepted in the sense that they had not pursued further action. She said her family's tradition included the phrase that the man was dealt with by his own people, which in the context of Appalachian community justice was a form of acknowledgement that the family had administered a consequence, and that the consequence was considered, if not appropriate, at least genuine. The harm done to the Turner man. She was not specific. She said she had been told it was severe. She said she had been told the Turner man did not survive it, which is to say, the harm done to the Turner ancestor was lethal. Lemuel Bowling, in the reconstruction that fits the available fragments, killed a Turner man. When? The oral tradition of the Turner family, as Mrs. Turner reported it to Cawood, placed it in her grandparents' time, which, from her estimated birth year and the typical generation length of the period, puts us in the late 1830s or very early 1840s. This is consistent with the timeline. A killing in 1837, 1838, 1839, one of those years. A killing in the period when the community was close enough and isolated enough that everyone knew, but the formal legal apparatus was thin enough that a conviction was not certain. A killing that the community knew about, said matter having been resolved, but which was ultimately resolved within the family rather than through the courts. Why did Augustus's management of it stick? Why did the Turners accept dealt with by his own people rather than pressing for formal justice? This is the question that gets to the heart of how extra-legal community justice functioned in that time and place. The answer is not simple. It is not simply that the Turners were powerless or afraid of the Bowlings. Though the dynamics of two established families in a small community were always complex, and power was never evenly distributed. It is not simply that the Bowlings paid some form of compensation to the Turners, though something of that kind may have occurred. The more plausible answer is that the Turners accepted the resolution because the resolution was real. Lemuel Bowling was gone. He had not fled to another county to live out his days in comfortable exile from the consequences of what he had done. He was contained. He was kept. He could never harm anyone else. The Turner family may not have known the precise nature of the containment, may not have known about the stone room and the chain, but they may have been told enough to know that he was not free, that he was not unpunished, that the Bowling family had administered a consequence that was severe and permanent. This is the logic of extralegal justice in communities without reliable law. It works. When it works not through the majesty of formal procedure, but through the community's direct knowledge of consequences. The Turners could observe that Lemuel Bowling was gone, not free, gone, permanently removed from the ordinary world, and they could accept that as a form of justice, even without knowing exactly what it consisted of. The community knew, in the general way, that communities know things without official acknowledgement, that something had happened. Something had been done. The Bowling family had dealt with it. And so the silence held, not because everyone was ignorant, but because most people knew only the shape of the thing, not its contents. And the shape was sufficient. A man who had killed someone had been dealt with. The community could live with that shape. It could fold it into the background of ordinary life and leave it there. What it could not fold in, what nobody had accounted for, was time. The community that could hold the shape of a secret in 1840 was not the community of 1870 or 1906. The people who knew what dealt with meant, who knew its specific weight and texture, died. Their children knew less. Their grandchildren knew only the prohibition, and the river, which knew nothing and cared for nothing, rose in March of 1906 and stripped away 60 years of accumulated silence in 6 hours. But Lemuel's crime, as serious as it was not the oldest thing in that chamber. The chain that held him was older than he was. The room that contained him was older than his crime. And to understand what the room was built for, what Absalom Bowling built it for. In the 1780s, in the years when the settlement on the South Fork was just beginning, you have to go back to the beginning of the Bowling family in Owsley County, which is the beginning of the county itself, and you have to ask a question that nobody in 1906 thought to ask, because nobody in 1906 knew the blacksmiths had dated the ironwork to the 18th century. The question is, was Lemuel the first? Absalom Bowling came to the South Fork in approximately 1782. The exact year is uncertain. Land records from the period are irregular, and the original settlement was essentially extra-legal in the sense that the formal survey and patent process that would eventually structure Kentucky land ownership was still catching up to the people who were already there. He came from Virginia, as best as can be determined, with a wife and several children, and he built a homestead on the South Fork that would become the Bowling family seat for 5 generations and more. He was, by all accounts, a man of energy and capability, the kind of man who founds things, who establishes things, who leaves marks on the landscape that persist long after the man himself is gone. The room was one of those marks. It was built by a skilled mason, which is not what you would expect from a frontier settler in the 1780s. But Absalom Bowling's background is obscure enough that a period of skilled labor, apprenticed to a mason perhaps, in Virginia before the move west, is entirely possible. The stonework is too careful to be the product of an untrained hand. The lintel stone alone, a single piece of dressed limestone spanning the full width of the doorway, represents a level of craft that took years to learn. The fitting of the walls without mortar, tight enough to be essentially weatherproof over a century and a quarter, this was not the work of a man who had simply decided to build a room. This was the work of a man who knew how to build a room, and had decided to build this particular room with this particular permanence. And the ring embedded in the far wall at standing height, set with the kind of permanent anchoring that is not done by accident, that requires specific intention and specific technique. You do not set a ring in a stone wall like that unless you intend for something to be attached to it. And you do not intend for something to be attached to it at that height unless what you intend to attach is a person. The ring was built into the room. It was part of the original construction. It was not added later for Lemuel. It was there before Lemuel. It was there before Augustus. It was there, in some form, from the beginning. Which means the beginning had someone in it, too. Who? We do not know. We may never know. The record of Absalom Bowling's life on the South Fork is thin and fragmentary. A land patent here, a court appearance there, the birth records of children, a letter of reference from a Virginia man who knew him before the move west. Nothing in that record suggests violence. Nothing suggests a man who kept people chained in stone rooms. But the record of the founding generation in communities like this one is always thin, always partial, always missing the texture of daily life and the nature of private decisions. What the record contains is what found its way into official channels, and official channels in the 1780s on the Kentucky frontier were very few and very narrow. There is one more thing. In the church records of a Baptist congregation that served the South Fork settlement in the 1790s and early 1800s, records that survive in partial form in a collection at the University of Kentucky. There is a notation in a matter-of-fact hand that suggests the scribe considered it unremarkable about a disciplinary proceeding in approximately 1793 involving a member identified only by surname, Bowling. The nature of the proceeding is not specified. The outcome is given as resolved within the family, which echoes the court record from the 1840s with an eerie precision. Resolved within the family. The same phrase, 50 years apart. The same solution to a problem that the community knew about and the family administered. Whether the family member involved in 1793 was Absalom, or one of Absalom's sons or relatives, whether the resolution involved the room or some other consequence, whether the person dealt with in 1793 was the original occupant of the chamber. All of this is inference. Everything beyond the phrase resolved within the family is speculation. But the phrase itself is a fact. The pattern it suggests is a fact. The room existed before Lemuel. The ring was there before Lemuel. And in the 1790s, something involving a bowling was resolved within the family. Lemuel may not have been the first person kept in that room. The Bowling family secret may not have started with Augustus's terrible decision in the 1840s. It may have started with Absalom in the 1780s or 1790s, on the day he set that ring into the stone. The day he decided that the Bowling family, on the South Fork of the Kentucky River, in the hills of what would eventually be called Owsley County, would handle its worst within itself. That the chamber would be the family's solution to the problem of members who exceeded what the community could manage through ordinary means. That the chain would be the family's answer to the question of what you do with someone you cannot release and cannot kill. Whether this was wisdom or horror, whether the Bowling family's multi-generational practice of private justice was a remarkable act of restraint, a preference for containment over killing at a time when killing would have been unremarkable, or a monstrous arrogance, a family's assumption that it could substitute itself for all external judgment and execute sentences without accountability, is not a question with a clean answer. It may not be a question with any answer that does not require you to also answer other questions. What do you do when the law is absent? What do you do when the community's alternative to your solution is a rope in the dark? What do you do when every road available to you leads somewhere terrible? And the question is only which terrible destination you can live with. These are not historical questions. They are questions that history poses to us, and they are unanswerable, and that is why they persist. Absalom Bowling was 31 years old when he came to the South Fork. If the birth year suggested by the Virginia records is approximately correct, he had a wife named Martha. She appears in the land patent as Martha Bowling, wife of Absalom, and children whose names are recoverable from later records. At least 3 sons and 2 daughters. The sons, in order of birth, being the founders of the several Bowling branches that would spread across Owsley County over the next century. He settled on 120 acres of bottomland and ridge, and he cleared it, and he farmed it, and he built a house and outbuildings and all the structures that a functioning farm in the late 18th century required. He was a blacksmith, or had been, or could work as one. The Virginia records include a brief notation identifying him as a smith, and the quality of the ironwork in the stone chamber's chain and ring is consistent with a man who had trained in the craft. A blacksmith in a frontier settlement was not a specialized artisan, separate from farming life. He was a man who could do both, who worked the land in the growing seasons and the forge when the land required less, who served his community's need for iron goods while sustaining his own holding. The chain in the stone room, heavy, well-made, constructed for permanence rather than economy, was the work of a man who knew iron. The ring embedded in the wall, set with a technique that required both masonry skill and knowledge of how iron behaved under stress, was the work of a man comfortable in both crafts. Absalom built the room, and Absalom made the chain. This is not speculation. It is the conclusion that follows from the physical evidence and the historical record. The question is only when and for whom. The settlement on the South Fork in the 1780s was not a gentle place. This is not a romantic or sentimental observation. It is simply what the historical record of the period tells us. The communities that established themselves in the Kentucky backcountry in the years immediately following the Revolution were under pressures of multiple kinds. The ongoing threat of violence from displaced native peoples, whose land this had been. The internal pressures of a population that included men of every character type, including the violent and the dangerous, the complete absence of reliable external authority, and the ordinary brutalities of poverty, proximity, and survival in an environment that offered little margin for error. Violence in such communities was not exceptional. It was a recurrent feature of daily life, managed as best as the community could manage it through the informal mechanisms of social pressure and community consequence. When formal authority was absent, families were the unit of management. This is the core of what the Bowling story is about, at every layer. The family as the institution that absorbs, manages, and suppresses what cannot be handled any other way. A community without courts, without a regular sheriff, without the mechanisms of formal accountability, delegates its hardest problems to the families involved. The Bowlings, for reasons that are not entirely clear from the available record, took this delegation seriously and took it to an extreme. The Baptist Church disciplinary proceeding of 1793, the court reference from the 1840s, the chamber, the chain, the tally marks on 2 walls worth of stone, the pewter cup, mended, the Bible, worn to nothing. These things form a pattern that spans over a century, and the pattern says, the Bowling family, from its establishment on the South Fork in the 1780s to at least the 1840s, and perhaps beyond, maintained a private mechanism of justice that operated completely outside any external accountability. It was not, in the records it left, sadistic. The care given to whoever was held in that room, the quality of the objects provided, the act of mending a broken cup, the act of reading Job aloud in the dark, these suggest a family that was not indifferent to the suffering it was causing, that was not comfortable with cruelty for its own sake. The suffering was considered necessary. The chain was considered deserved. But the person attached to the chain was still given a blanket. Whether Absalom's first occupant, whoever that person was, whatever that person had done, was given the same small dignities, we cannot know. Whether the tradition of care that Augustus clearly maintained was inherited from Absalom, passed down with the prohibition the way the prohibition itself was passed down, or whether Augustus arrived at it independently, reasoning his way to it from his Christian duty, we cannot know. What we know is that when Lemuel was in that room, someone maintained the cup, maintained the plate, brought the food, brought the Bible. Someone sat in the dark with him, probably, at least sometimes, and read, and Lemuel counted. 3,000 days, 3,500 days, 8 years, 9 years, 10. The tally marks on the wall are the only record Lemuel Bowling left in the world. No census entry after 1840, no death record, no grave with a name on it. Only marks on stone, groups of 5, the 5th crossed through. A man maintaining his count of time the way you maintain it when time is the only thing you have. When you have no agency over your circumstances, no ability to change anything, no prospect of change, counting is a form of ownership. The days were still his, even if nothing else was. He marked them because they were his. What did Lemuel think in the years in that room? Did he believe he deserved it? Did the moral frame his brother maintained, the chain was earned, find any purchase in Lemuel himself? Did he rage against it, and then accommodate himself to it, and then eventually arrive at something beyond both rage and accommodation? Did the book of Job speak to him? Did he find in Job's situation the inexplicable suffering? the unanswerable question of why, the eventual silence of the universe in response to his demand for accounting, a reflection of his own? Or did he find in Job's situation the thing that made it unbearable, the recognition that there was no proportionate answer coming, that the scale of his punishment was not going to be explained to him in terms he could accept? He died in that room. He died chained to a wall in a stone room in the Kentucky mountains, probably in the late 1840s or early 1850s, having been there for something between 8 and 10 years. He died of natural causes. That is what the physical evidence shows. No trauma to the bone, no sign of a violent end. He simply reached the end of a life that had been lived for its last years in a 12 by 8 foot stone room. When he died, the tally marks were on the wall, and the Bible was beside him, and the pewter cup was near his hand, and the blanket, what was left of it, was around him. And then Augustus, who outlived his brother by decades, maintained the chamber. He maintained the silence. He did not clear it out, did not remove the remains, did not build over the doorway. He left Lemuel where he was. Whether this was a practical decision, the removal of human remains from a private setting was not simple in the 1840s, and what story would he tell? Or whether it was something more than that, some form of acknowledgement that the man he had kept there deserved to stay where he was until he could be properly accounted for, we do not know. Lemuel remained in the room, and the room remained on the ridge, and the ridge remained on the Bowling property, and the Bowling family maintained the prohibition. No one goes in, no one speaks of it. Augustus transmitted this to Elias. Elias transmitted the prohibition and the moral frame. He earned it to Rufus. Rufus transmitted the prohibition alone, stripped of the frame, to no one, because the flood came first. And the river decided in March of 1906 that some things do not stay buried. After the investigation, after the burial, after the stone that said, "Known to God," was set in the Bowling family plot, life in Owsley County continued the way it had always continued, with difficulty and with endurance, and with the ordinary weight of being alive in one of the poorest, most isolated counties in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. The railroad would come eventually. The roads would improve eventually. The world that the South Fork settlement had inhabited for 120 years, the world of total isolation, of communities completely sufficient unto themselves in their justice and their silence, was already changing in 1906 and would change faster in the decades ahead. Willis Bowling grew up. He grew up into the 20th century, which is to say, into a world that was progressively less like the world his great-great-grandfather Absalom had founded, and progressively more like everywhere else. He worked the family farm. He raised a family of his own. He lived through the Depression and the wars, and the slow grinding transformation of Appalachian life that the 20th century brought. The coal economy, the outmigration, the poverty programs, the complicated relationship between the mountains and the idea of America. He lived to 94, which means he carried what he had seen at the age of 11 for 83 years. He was asked about it. Of course, he was asked about it. The story never entirely left the community's memory, never entirely stopped circulating in the background of Owsley County's self-understanding. People knew. Not the full story, not the assembled version, not the Augustus and Lemuel and the letter, and the Turner man, and Absalom's ring. But the shape of it, the knowledge that the Bowling family had something old and dark on its ridge, that the flood of 1906 had exposed something that the family had kept, that there was a stone over a nameless grave in the Bowling plot that said only known to God. Willis was asked about it, and he was careful in the way of a man who had spent 83 years deciding exactly how careful to be. He confirmed the existence of the chamber. He confirmed that his father had known of it. He confirmed the stone in the family plot and its inscription. He did not discuss his father's words on the morning of the discovery. I hoped the river would never find it, or at least there is no record of his having discussed them. He did not discuss what Sheriff Combs's investigation found, or did not find. He did not discuss what he might have eventually learned about the connection between the remains and his own family, though it seems almost certain that he knew by the end of his life at least the broad outlines of what is reconstructed here. What he said in the account that has been transmitted from the last interview he gave on the subject, when he was very old and the interviewer was a local journalist writing a piece for the county paper, was this: "Some things are between you and the river. It is an Appalachian answer, which is to say, it is an answer that contains several things at once. It contains a refusal to discuss something more fully than you have chosen to discuss it. It contains an acknowledgement that some things belong to a category beyond ordinary human accounting. It contains a certain attitude toward the natural world, toward the river, as a kind of authority or witness that stands outside the human systems of justice and record-keeping, that knows what it knows regardless of what human beings choose to say about it. And it contains, perhaps, a small inheritance from the man in the room, from the man who counted days on a stone wall in a chamber that the river eventually opened, the recognition that some reckonings are not administered by courts or families or communities, but by time and water and the patient indifference of the physical world. The river knew. The river had always known. The river was just waiting. Willis Bowling died in 1989 at the age of 94. The stone in the Bowling family plot that says known to God still stands. The chamber on the ridge spur, its doorway resealed after the 1906 investigation by an act that was neither official nor documented, is under several feet of soil and root. The South Fork still rises in hard rain. In 2019, a woman named Dr. Caroline Bowling, an associate professor of history at Eastern Kentucky University and a direct descendant of Rufus Bowling, which makes her a direct descendant of Elias, Augustus, and whatever Absalom built in the 1780s. Filed idea with the Owsley County Probate Court requesting authorization for the exhumation and DNA analysis of the remains buried under the known to God stone. Her petition cited advances in forensic genetics that had not been available in 1906, the ability of DNA analysis to establish family relationships across generations, and the historical significance of establishing the identity of the individual who'd been confined in the chamber and who had died there. Her reasoning was careful and scholarly. She argued that the question of who was buried under that stone was not merely a genealogical curiosity, but a historical question with implications for the understanding of extra-legal justice in isolated Appalachian communities, for the understanding of how families in pre-Civil War Kentucky managed violence within their own members, for the broader question of what happens to communities and to the descendants of communities when they administer justice privately and pass down the resulting silence across generations. She argued that the man under the stone deserved to have his name known, that the inscription known to God was a beautiful sentiment, but that a man who had lived and suffered and counted his days on a stone wall deserved to also be known by human record. She argued, in the careful language of a professional historian, that the truth had been buried long enough. The petition divided the Bowling family. This should not be surprising. The Bowling family had been divided by this question in various implicit ways for 160 years, divided between those who maintained the silence and those who felt the weight of it, between those for whom the prohibition was a form of loyalty and those for whom it had become a form of complicity. The explicit division, when the petition made the question direct and unavoidable, simply gave form to what had always been there. Some family members supported the petition. Their reasoning was similar to Dr. Bowling's. The man in the room deserved a name. Whatever he had done, he was a person, and persons deserve to be known. The DNA analysis might confirm what the historical reconstruction suggests, might establish definitively that the remains are those of a Bowling family member, specifically of the generation and the relationship that the fragments indicate. But even if it confirmed only that the remains were someone's, that confirmation would be something. It would be better than the stone that said nothing except that God knew. Some family members opposed it. Their reasoning was also coherent, also coming from a real place. The prohibition had been in place for 5 generations. The family had maintained it through 2 floods, a civil war, the end of the old Appalachian isolation, the transformation of everything around them. The man under the stone was gone. Whatever he had done was done. Exhuming him would not undo it. Establishing his name would not give him back his years. All it would do would be to attach to living Bowling family members, people who had not made any of these decisions, people who were simply the descendants of those who had, a public record of something that their ancestors had done and tried to contain. The argument was not that the secret should continue to be kept. It was that the secret had already been revealed in 1906, and that the revelation had been sufficient, and that disturbing the grave of a man who had already been properly buried served no purpose that outweighed the intrusion on his rest and on the family's. Both positions are held by people who feel deeply about them. Both positions contain genuine ethical content. The petition, as of this account, has not been resolved. It is pending, in the way of legal proceedings in small counties, with limited resources and complicated jurisdictional questions about what exactly constitutes authorized exhumation of pre-20th century remains. It may be resolved. It may become one of those legal questions that persists unresolved for years, eventually becoming moot when the question is forgotten or when some change in circumstances makes it irrelevant. Or it may be granted. The DNA may be extracted, the analysis may be run, the name may be confirmed or denied. The stone that says known to God may be amended with a second stone, or may stand as it is, and the amendment may be made only in the historical record, in the documentary record, in the record that Luther Cawood began in 1903, with his careful notebook and his conversations with old people who remembered things. Dr. Caroline Bowling. In the acknowledgments of an academic paper she published in 2021 about extra-legal justice in antebellum Appalachian communities. A paper that does not name the Bowling family directly, but whose subject matter will be immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with this story, writes that she became interested in the subject because of a family story she heard as a child. She describes the story as fragmentary and indirect, transmitted in the way of things that adults discuss at the edge of children's awareness, never quite saying what they mean, never quite naming what they're talking about. She describes the feeling of knowing as a child that something existed in her family's history that had weight to it. Not quite a secret, because it wasn't kept perfectly, but not quite a story either, because it was never told directly. She describes coming to understand, over years, that the fragmentary and indirect quality of the transmission was itself part of the thing being transmitted, that the incompleteness was not accidental, but structural, that each generation had received less than the previous one, and had passed on less still, and that this progressive diminishment was the mechanism by which the secret survived. Not by being kept perfectly, but by being eroded intentionally, each generation stripping away another layer of specificity until what remained was only the prohibition and the weight, the rule without the reason, the warning without the explanation. She writes that she believes the progressive diminishment was itself a form of mercy, that Augustus, who knew everything and carried the full weight of it, chose to give his son Elias a lighter burden, the moral frame, rather than the full horror. That Elias, whether deliberately or because the moral frame was all he truly had, gave Rufus a lighter burden still. The prohibition without the frame. That Rufus, standing in the rain outside the stone doorway on March 12th, 1906, had been carrying the lightest version of the burden, the rule, the chamber, the understanding that the thing must never be examined, and that the flood had, in one morning, given it back all its weight. She writes that the stone in the Bowling family plot says, "Known to God," and that she finds this inscription both beautiful and inadequate. Beautiful because there is a real humility in it, an acknowledgement that the human record has failed this man, that the official record has nothing to say about him, that only something beyond the human record can hold him fully. Inadequate because the human record, however incomplete, is all that the living have. We cannot access what God knows. We can only work with what is available to us, which means the fragments, the notebooks, the census records, the court notations, the oral traditions of old women who heard things at whiskey gatherings, the pewter cup repaired with solder, the Bible worn to nothing by use. We can assemble the fragments. We can tell the story in the only direction that gives it its full meaning, which is backward, from the finding to the hiding, from the flood to the chamber, from the chamber to the decision, from the decision to the crime, from the crime to the man who committed it, from the man to the family that made him, from the family to the founder who set the ring in the stone for reasons that are now lost, except as inference and pattern, and the echo of a phrase, resolved within the family. We can say what we know. We can acknowledge what we don't know. We can hold the complexity of what Augustus did, not monstrous, not heroic, human, terribly human, a man with bad choices making the one he believed was least wrong, without resolving it into something more comfortable than it is. We can think about what it means to inherit a secret, to carry a prohibition without a reason, to be the keeper of a silence whose original content has been stripped away until only the keeping itself remains. We can think about what it means to administer justice privately in a community without reliable external justice, and whether the privacy of the administration changes the nature of the justice administered. We can sit with the tally marks: 3,000 days, 3,500. A man who had nothing else counting the only thing he had left, marking the wall with his chain in the dark of a stone room, while somewhere above him the river ran, and the seasons turned, and the world he had forfeited continued its ordinary business of being the world. We can sit with the book of Job, worn to nothing, present to the end. Whatever comfort it offered, and whatever accusation, and whatever it finally said, in the end, to Job, to anyone who holds it long enough, which is not that suffering is explained, but that it is witnessed, that the universe is aware of what it costs to be a person in it, and does not explain itself, and does not have to. And this is the condition of being alive in the world that was made. Whether Lemuel read Job as a prisoner seeking meaning, or whether someone read it to him as comfort, no one knows. The river took the soil and the root and the decades, and left the stone doorway standing in the morning light of March 12th, 1906. An 11-year-old boy named Willis Bowling saw it, and ran, and spent the rest of his 94 years carrying what he saw. The South Fork of the Kentucky River, which has been rising and falling in those hills since before any Bowling set foot on its banks, rose again last spring, and will rise again next spring, and does not distinguish between what it exposes and what it buries, between what it gives back and what it takes. It knows what it knows. It keeps its own account. Some things are between you and the river, but the river talks